All right, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Norwegian Defense University College, and the Marine Corps University Foundation, welcome to this week's Arctic Security Symposium, an inaugural series exploring the policies, strategies, and tactics underpinning security in the High North. I am your host, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Clark, this year's U.S. Coast Guard student at Marine Corps Command and Staff College, and I'm pleased to moderate this panel on maritime issues in the Arctic. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of Marine Corps University, Norwegian Defense University College, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Naval War College, the Royal Canadian Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, or any other agency of the U.S. or Norwegian government. We will be recording this panel for the benefit of those in our community of interest who would not be able to join us today. So we ask that you be mindful of keeping your microphones muted to avoid disrupting the presentation, as well as turn your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our guest presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have a question, please type it into the group chat and we will ask the question to the panel on your behalf. Please note that we will only accept questions via the WebEx chat and that the Facebook live stream will not be active for the question and answer portion. Each of our panelists will provide roughly 10 minutes of introductory commentary, and we'll have roughly 20 minutes of joint Q&A to the panel once each panelist has had the chance to make their remarks. So maritime issues in the Arctic are about as vast as they are complicated, but I'm confident that our panel today will enlighten us and provide us all a better understanding of these complex issues. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Walter Berbrick from the U.S. Naval War College and the Newport Arctic Scholars Initiative. Dr. Berbrick is an associate professor in the Wargaming Department, founding director of the Arctic Studies Group, and co-lead scholar of the Newport Arctic Scholars Initiative. He has authored many reports and publications on defense and foreign policy issues and is a co-author of the forthcoming book, Newport Manual on Arctic Security. Most recently, he served as a senior Arctic policy advisor to the Secretary of the Navy and special representative for the Arctic region at the U.S. State Department. He is an International Affairs Fellow and member with the Council on Foreign Relations, holds a doctorate from Northeastern University, and has served 10 years in the U.S. Navy. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Rear Admiral Steve Waddell, Vice Commander, U.S. Second Fleet. His command tours include command of the frigates HMCS Charlottetown and HMCS Fredericton, and Commander Canadian Forces Base Esquimalt on Canada's west coast. His other operational sea tours include CENTCOM and NATO deployments to the Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, Adriatic Sea, and the waters off the Horn of Africa and Korean Peninsula. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Manitoba, a master's degree from King's College London, a master's degree from Salve Regina University, and is a 2014 graduate of the United States Naval War College. He is also a graduate of the Combined Force Maritime Component Commander course. Next, I'd like to introduce Captain Steinar Torset. He is the section head for military strategy and joint operations at the Norwegian Defense University College Command and Staff College. As a naval officer, Captain Torset completed basic training with the Norwegian Coastal Artillery and aided in the development of the Coastal Ranger Commando. His prior assignments include the United Kingdom Marine Battle Staff, U.S. Fleet Forces Command with the Combined Joint Forces from the Sea Center of Excellence, and the National Joint Headquarters in Northern Norway. His deployments include Operation Unifil with Norwegian fast patrol boats in the East Mediterranean Sea, Operation Enduring Freedom embarked on a German frigate, and Operation Atalanta, the European Union campaign against piracy in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, where he served in the headquarters in Northwood, United Kingdom. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have joining us from Norway, Dr. Ingrid Handeland, who is currently serving as a legal advisor to the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and holds a research position at the Royal Norwegian Naval Academy in Bergen. Dr. Handeland holds a Master's of Law from the University of Bergen with a specialization in law of the sea and in Chinese commercial law. In addition to her formal studies, she participated in an extended exchange program in China with the Jiayuan law offices and as a trainee at the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Beijing. She joined the Sea Power 2040 project at the Royal Norwegian Naval Academy in 2018 and is studying topics related to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, China, Svalbard, and the Northern Sea Route. Previously, she served as part of CNO Norway's legal advisory team, where she focused on UNCLOS and related topics that directly influence Norwegian maritime operational planning. She also participated in the last 2 sessions of the Newport Arctic Scholars Initiative. So now that I've introduced all of our guests, I'd like to open up the conversation with Dr. Berbrick.
Thanks, Brian. And good morning to everyone here, and good afternoon to all our friends in Norway and in Europe. Thanks, Ryan, for that introduction, and a special thanks to General Field for the invitation, and really to the entire American Norwegian team that made this event possible. It's a real honor to be here in Quantico for what I believe to be the first of many important Arctic security events here at Marine Corps University. You know, the very fabric of this institution was built on General Gray's idea that we need leaders who can think critically, who can act decisively in the face of ambiguity, fog, friction, leaders who can outthink and outmaneuver our opponents in future operating environments. And nowhere is that more true than in a blue Arctic. And a blue Arctic provides that general idea that the Arctic is gradually turning from white to blue. And by that, I mean warming temperatures and reduced ice coverage is creating increased access and making Arctic waters more navigable, which enables nations, industries, and their navies to access new markets, new resources, and most importantly, new sea routes. And a blue Arctic is the underlying reason why we created the Newport Arctic Scholars Initiative, and why we, under the leadership of Secretary Braithwaite, published the Department of the Navy's Blue Arctic Strategy earlier this year. And NASI, for short, is one of many examples that we can point to that really showcases the special relationship and friendship between Norway and the United States. Admiral Lars Sonnes, former chief of the Norwegian Navy and Coast Guard, become a good friend, a good colleague of mine at the War College. When he retired and came to Newport, we kind of put our heads together and launched this program 3 years ago. And it's the first of its kind that brings together an Arctic scholar and a sailor, an operator, from each of the 8 Arctic states to collaborate on a multidisciplinary research project. Our research priorities are defined by Arctic Chiefs of Navy. And so we meet in person over 3 seminars, and then we collaborate virtually over 10 months. And while this initiative is designed to include Russia, current DoD policy prevents Russia from participating, but we're hopeful that we might be able to invite them in the future. So we really did kick off with a blank sheet of paper. And naturally, as you can imagine, without Russia in the room, our discussions really centered on how do we as Arctic states counter Russian assertiveness and expansion. And it was clear to all of us right away that Russia increasingly asserts its territorial dominance along the Northern Sea Route as it secures its economic interests, expands its military presence, and it continues to invest in new offensive and defensive capabilities. And we all agreed that Russia has, every right to build these capabilities, but it's really the non-transparent nature of its military activity and the unlawful regulation of the Northern Sea Route that undermines global interests, promotes instability, and ultimately degrades security in the region. And so we took a step back and we challenged ourselves and one another to think a little differently, to consider Russia's perspective, even though they physically weren't part of the initiative. So we brought in Russian experts. We were able to engage with actual Russian scholars through other forums, such as through the Marshall Center. And we asked the question, what are those common challenges to all Arctic states? And 3 threats emerged: increased likelihood of friction, miscalculation, and potential conflict, spillover of major power competition into the Arctic, and the most significant and long-term challenge facing all Arctic states is the rise and influence of China's fourth ocean strategy. And so over the last decade, we watched the Chinese Communist Party claim itself as a near-Arctic state, trying to normalize its presence through a polar Silk Road, using those same coercive tactics that have defined the Belt and Road Initiative. It's investing in Arctic shipbuilding, polar-capable vessels, LNG tankers, icebreakers, and an infrastructure to improve its access. And so these investments, coupled with its expanding global fishing fleet, and the scientific, economic, and the academic linkages to people in Arctic nations, including joint ventures with Russia, I think will continue to rise in the decades ahead. So it became clear to this international group of experts that we can expect the CCP to secure Arctic sea lines of communication through increased Chinese naval deployments, both on, below, and above Arctic waters. In fact, 6 weeks ago, we observed 4 Chinese ships operating off of Alaska. And thanks to the Coast Guard, they were there to to guide them. Our task force, that task force included 4 vessels, right? A guided missile cruiser, a destroyer, an intelligence vessel, as well as an auxiliary vessel. And I think the message from China, from my perspective, was pretty clear that, and it was to the US and to Russia, that they maintain the ability to strategically challenge the United States and Russia's homeland. And their Navy has the ability to conduct sustained operations in the Arctic. So we realized, this group of experts realized, that peace and stability isn't possible without shared awareness of national interests and challenges, without confidence building measures for dialogue and cooperation, and without developing maritime capabilities while avoiding unnecessary escalation. So our group split up into 3 different working groups, created 30 international principles of Arctic security, and our work resulted in the forthcoming Newport Manual on Arctic Security, which really provides a forward-thinking, comprehensive blueprint for how navies and nations can apply and integrate sea power in a blue Arctic. And while they reflect consensus, they do not, represent the official positions of Arctic states, but they do provide a starting point for dialogue. And so when we briefed out the Arctic heads of Navy in Bergen in 2019, they charged the next group of scholars, last year's group, with focusing on one particular principle, and that was frameworks for Arctic security. And so we first asked the question, why do we need these frameworks in the first place? And in other words, what are those primary catalysts to instability? So I'll highlight a few of them, many of which have been talked about already. And then really, it starts with that central dilemma that we face today, and that's increased military activity by Arctic and non-Arctic states, and too few frameworks for dialogue and cooperation increases the risk of friction, miscalculation, and conflict. And so to address this, our report recommended that we develop an Arctic Qs, a code of unplanned encounters at sea, a similar framework that was spearheaded by the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. We also focus on the Bering Strait, which we believe will over time be a strategic choke point, as well as the Northern Sea Route, and the North Pole, which came up as well. And while these claims, specifically in the North Pole, can be adjudicated by the Commission on the Conventional Limits of the Continental Shelf, I think, right, it's a long, tedious process. It's and scientific and technical in nature. And regardless, individual states are still left with negotiating through diplomacy and potentially through the use of force. And the other challenge that we really centered around was on the Northern Sea Route. Russia considers it to be an internal passage, and foreign ships, whether that's commercial or military, really don't have the right to access it without their permission. So, of course, the U.S. opposes this view and has the global responsibility to preserve the rights and duties of navigation in the Arctic, just like anywhere else in the world. And so these challenges, coupled with Greenlandic independence and the Norwegian island of Svalbard, were those major catalysts to instability. And so against this backdrop, we examined, the gaps and limitations of frameworks of Arctic security. Some argued using the NATO-Russia Arctic Council, but Russia distrust in NATO really didn't seem like a realistic long-term viable option. Others argued for using the Arctic Council, which again, its mandate prevents it, but changing that mandate, I think, would take away from a lot of the good work that the Arctic Council does. And so the Arctic really needs a new high-level political military forum to discuss and develop multilateral solutions to some of the world's biggest challenges, and creating those voluntary, non-binding, deconflicting measures and confidence-building measures. And those frameworks are also limited between the international navies and coast guards. So Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, led by UCOM, is really focused on search and rescue. The Arctic Chiefs of Defense meetings, as well as Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, really hasn't met since 2014. And like the Arctic Council, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, by changing its mandate from soft security issues to hard security issues, would take away from a lot of the good work that's being done through the forum. And so our report centered around the creation of an Arctic Ocean Naval Symposium, a symposium that brings together international naval leaders from around the world to talk about Arctic security and defense issues. And so when we presented the work last year to Arctic Chiefs of Navy, they said, we really want you to focus on this. And so that was our charge this year. And so our work has evolved into a draft charter of business for an Arctic Ocean Naval Symposium. And that'll be the focus of our discussions in Copenhagen this upcoming December. And so taken together, this work really formed the foundation for the Department of the Navy's Arctic strategy. And which is the central theme, right? Peace and prosperity isn't possible without persistent American presence and partnerships. And so the strategy calls for an enhanced naval presence, strengthening cooperative partnerships, and building a more capable naval Arctic force. It calls out key investments in infrastructure, communications, science and technology, and manned and unmanned platforms, especially ice strength and surface platforms. At the same time, it calls for evolving and adapting some of our operational concepts, EABO, DMOs, things that have come up already, as well as increasing our research efforts, our wargaming, education training through events like this. And it also, in terms of strengthening our cooperative partnerships, it's not only creating new ones or strengthening the existing ones, but creating new ones, especially with countries from the Indo-Pacific region, which we don't normally take into consideration when we think about Arctic issues, as well as some of our other European friends and allies who are non-Arctic states. And so in these areas, and really the last line of effort really focuses on increasing our presence. And that's through greater exercises and operations from Alaska to Maine. But to really have and the general mentioned it yesterday, right? To really have a credible presence to effectively deter and rapidly respond in crisis, right? We can't be present just in one domain. We can't just be present in one season, but in every domain and in every season, 365 days a year. So, which is why I think the Department of the Navy should spearhead a few different initiatives, starting first with the development or the creation of an Arctic-focused surface squadron, potentially located with a maritime headquarters of an ally or a Coast Guard partner. Consider standing up an Arctic Maritime Task Force. And then we need to look at ways of how we're potentially creating a new numbered fleet that that has sole responsibility of the Arctic, and we can talk to that more in Q&A. And so with that, I want to appreciate the time and look forward to our Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Berbrick. And now I'll open the floor to Admiral Waddell.
Hey, thanks, Ryan, and for shaping our comments here and making sure you keep us on track. I know that's going to be important. There's always far too little time allocated to some of this really important conversation. But again, over to you to make sure you keep us where we need to be. Listen, a great conversation and starter from Walter there. I spent a year of my life at the Naval War College, and what a fantastic facility, and some great folks really making us think, challenging us, and making sure that we focus our efforts and energy where we need to in some of these strands, these themes, these challenges. The Arctic, of course, front and center on a lot of these. And applaud, Walter, your work with Lars on your initiatives. So I had a chance to meet with Lars a little while back over at a different conference, and we talked a little bit about some of your work. So well done there. I also know that you heard already from a couple of times Chief of Staff at JFC Norfolk. He's chimed in with some comments from what he's been hearing. So I did have a couple of comments kind of built around on behalf of JFC Norfolk in my opening comments, but I think you've heard a little bit about that already, so I can steer a little bit away from that. But suffice to say that both Second Fleet and JFC Norfolk stood up in 2018. We know all the reasons why that occurred. With the focus from Florida to Finnmark, seabed to space, certainly in terms of joint deterrence operating areas for JFC Norfolk all the way up into the high north, that's certainly the focus as they bring together that collection of allies to make sure that we're posturing ourselves accordingly in that space. But Second Fleet, of course, has a critical role within that, starting with, of course, our commander, dual-hatted commander, Vice Admiral Dan Dwyer, who's the commander of JFC Norfolk, and of course my boss here in Second Fleet. So that allows a lot of synergy between the commands in our focus as we support from a tactical or high tactical perspective, how we command and control maritime forces in the Atlantic, throughout the Atlantic, into the high north, for whoever requires it. And whether that's Nav North, which is under the Northcom commander here on the continent, or whether that's in support of Nav Ur, which of course supports EUCOM. I've just highlighted 2 American commands there, but importantly, how do we make sure we're postured as a deployable, capable maritime headquarters, a component command for NATO, whether that's for JFC Norfolk, which of course is our partner here in Norfolk, or perhaps other NATO commands or Joint Task Force commanders. So this is kind of the space that we think about as we make sure we're ready to enact all of the tenets of the Blue Arctic strategy and others to make sure that we're postured and capable and credible up into the Arctic region. You know, the Atlantic is not a safe haven anymore. Much training, force generation, preparation has occurred for many years, uncontested, to deploy and prepare and deploy forces throughout the world globally, often to the CENTCOM AOR, but not exclusively. But I just want to remind everybody who's participating here today and listening in that the Atlantic is contested space once again, and so that needs to frame our thinking, our response, how we posture our forces in our own backyard to make sure that we're ready for any contingency, any challenge that comes into our space, and with that, that colors and of course frames our thinking throughout as we prepare those forces. And I also noted. I was listening to one of the earlier panels, conversation about perhaps not necessarily more NATO in the Arctic, but more NATO partner capabilities in the Arctic. And one of the things I would perhaps say to that is that we need to also be mindful in thinking about our adversary and how they label our efforts. And so it doesn't really matter whether all of NATO is in the Arctic or whether an independent member of NATO is in the Arctic. It's all branded as NATO activity by the adversary. So we need to be mindful in thinking of that, is that we need to be better at coordinating, talking about, and communicating our efforts collectively, even if it is independent, even if it is a coalition amongst NATO members. But at the end of the day, the adversary views all of those effects as NATO activity. So we need to be mindful of that when we talk about whether NATO is in the Arctic or whether it's not. In terms of how we kind of frame our thinking and our preparation here, because as you know, and I would presume most of the folks at the college have read the Blue Arctic. I'll hold this up here. This is on my desk, a Blue Arctic. We use this to frame how we're going to get after some of the tactical and operational responses to make sure that we enact CNO guidance to get after this space. We know that it's about enhanced presence. We've heard lots of conversation about that, making sure that we're an integrated naval power able to operate in the littoral. We know that the submarine community has extensive experience operating in the high north and in the Arctic, but the surface community does not. We did back in World War II, but we haven't over the period of the Cold War and into perhaps since the end of the Cold War. So we need to be better and smarter in that space. And so, Walter was talking about, do we establish more persistent and consistent task groups that operate in that space? Lots of opinion with respect to that, but what is known is that rather than being episodic in the Arctic, we need to be sustained in the Arctic, particularly amongst the surface force as we see an increasingly blue Arctic. Part of that is making sure we do the partnership piece too. I would point out that in Second Fleet here, we have a number of exchange officers on the staff, myself included. There's no secret that to be better and operating in that environment, which is a collaborative coalition, international partner environment, you've got to have not only units and ships and capabilities operating up there, but you've got to have the people on the staff too that make sure that you can unlock those opportunities. So I'm here supporting from Canada, fully embedded into Second Fleet's team, battle rhythm, decision making, and we've got other officers from France, the UK, Norway, and others on staff, and we hope to grow that presence within the Second Fleet team. And then on top of that, we need to make sure that we bring credibility to the fight. And so having credible professional naval forces that are able to operate consistently, persistently in that environment, make sure that we can do that. And so we all know that the USN, as I already mentioned, with the submarine community, has spent many years already operating up in the Arctic. ICEX is an example, but there are other large exercises. Trident Juncture a few years back in 2018, 50,000 folks participating in that, 65 ships, 250 aircraft. You know, that represented a significant change from an alliance perspective at operating in the high north. But there's other things too where we're operating. So Second Fleet partners with the Canadians for Operation Nanook as an example. We partner with Sixth Fleet and Navigational to make sure that we have a holistic, contiguous perspective on the Atlantic when we're operating both in the NORTHCOM AOR and the EUCOM AOR. In fact, just recently, the guidance has been received from both of the components for each of those combatant commanders to make sure that Second Fleet can be agile in maneuver, agile in thought, and agile in response across the totality of the Atlantic. And so that's how we frame our thinking to make sure that we can respond in that environment. And so as we sustain and increase our presence, we need to make sure that we sustain it through, as I said, not episodic, but more sustained contributions. One of the challenges we find as we continue to push more frequently, particularly amongst the surface force into the north, is that logistics nodes are not there the way that they are in the rest of the more developed areas of the continents. And so you've got to bring logistics with you, and that the scope and scale of the distances we're talking about are extraordinary. You know, it's not lost on anyone, or it shouldn't be, that in getting across from the North American continent to Europe, it's actually takes a longer period of time to go from the east coast of North America up into the Arctic, and there's no logistics nodes when you get there. So you need to make sure that you're thinking that through as you plan and prepare to operate in those regions. Part of that, of course, is also making sure that our people are ready. So not only do we have exchange officers working in Second Fleet, we also push folks forward into other fleets. And so as an example, right now we have an officer riding on board Harry DeWolf, which is one of Canada's newest Arctic and offshore patrol ships, a US officer operating on board in the Arctic, having transited through the Northwest Passage as an example. These are opportunities that we take to make sure that we can spread that perspective, that collective understanding, to make sure that we are competent and credible in operating in those spaces. And then even now, bringing in more increasingly cooperative deployers. So Norway now has a frigate fully embedded within the Harry S. Truman Strike Group. They just finished a major force generation exercise as they get ready for follow-on deployments. And that frigate, the Nansen, will actually participate in all elements of that deployment. So that's another example of the kind of partnership that we bring in, whether it's NATO coming together in a true NATO command and control posture, or whether it's NATO partners integrating into a traditional US model. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we're working and we're partnering and we're pushing those capabilities out the door to get after all of the tenets in the strategy that we all know are there. So that's probably where I'll kind of leave it there in terms of setting the scene. I just want folks to know that Second Fleet, fully operational capable, stood up in 2018, have been operating consistently in this space for all the right reasons. That JFC Norfolk was stood up as well. And our focus is the Atlantic. Our focus is the high north. That's where we focus our attention every day, on that space. There are adversaries there. It is contested space once again, and that frames all of our thinking and our response to make sure that we can more persistently and consistently deploy operational and maritime effects into the Arctic. So I'll just leave it there and look forward to your questions afterwards.
Thank you, Admiral. Really appreciate that comprehensive discussion. So now I'm going to push it over to Captain Torset to give some Norwegian perspective.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for hosting this symposium. I have to say, and it's been really interesting, and it's an important topic we are discussing. So we heard about the Arctic Blueprint, and it is definitely an important document and strategy, and it's a really good contribution to put the Arctic with all its challenges on the agenda. NATO is not an exception. I mean, with a recently published Regional Perspectives report on the Arctic as a part of their strategic foresight analysis work, they are also sort of looking into the Arctic and the challenges, and are looking into several ways the Arctic might develop and the implications for NATO. The interesting part is, of course, the operationalization of such strategies. Operating in the Arctic requires to understand what is normal. And this goes for building and maintaining situational awareness. And in my view, only when you understand what is normal, you can understand and see the anomalies. And there is no doubt that understanding the normal in the Arctic has been challenging for the last couple of years, and especially after 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea. Due to international sanctions, most of the relations and cooperation between Russia and the Western world was banned, but not all of them. And we have heard about the Arctic Council. We have also slightly heard about the Arctic Coast Guard Forum as potential arenas for maintaining a dialogue with Russia. But back to normal, and I want to talk about two normals related to operating in the Arctic from a Norwegian perspective, that is anyway. And first, let's talk about what can be viewed as a normal behavior from the actors in the Arctic. I mean, the US clearly want to be an active actor in the region, and the Arctic Blueprint follows the 2018 National Defense Strategy and the Tri-Service Strategy Advantage at Sea, which came in 2020. And I would say the Blue Arctic is a forward-leaning strategy, emphasizing the requirement for presence in order to prevail in the day-to-day competition in the region. And presence in the region is important for many reasons we've heard earlier in this panel and other panels as well, but not necessarily a permanent presence, but a presence based on predictable strategy and maybe conducted in unpredictable operations, as it was described by the Atlantic Council. And based on the strategy, you should not be surprised when US Navy ships can be observed in the Barents Sea. But this kind of deployment will normally trigger a reaction. And I would say that's quite normal when it comes to international relations. You have actions and you have reactions. And when NATO executed the Trident Juncture exercise in 2018, it was no surprise that Russia reacted. It was rather expected. However, it's difficult to predict what that reaction might be, but you should prepare for a number of activities in order to be prepared. And often it is about being prepared to have the initiative to manage the narrative. And I think we've heard about this narrative earlier in this symposium. We know that false or fake news and claims is a part of the Russian information and propaganda campaign. So it's about being smart, being prepared, and deal with it. Because, I mean, NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it should be no surprise that the alliance could conduct exercises in the North Atlantic. Having said that, for too long, it was not the normal that NATO conducted large exercises like Trident Juncture. Having been occupied with out-of-area operations in Afghanistan, Gulf of Aden, the refocus on the Arctic was almost to be seen as an anomaly that some would claim contributes to instability and tension in the region. After 2014, the focus of the alliance and others shifted back to also include the Arctic, and is now about establishing a new normal and maintaining this normal. And I appreciate that I'm saying this in a time when Secretary General Stoltenberg recently said that the relationship between Russia and NATO is at its coolest in 30 years. Secondly, the other normal can be about climate and operating conditions. The Arctic is a vast region, as we have heard several times during this symposium, with at times harsh operating environment. And it's not all about getting icebreakers around that is required to operate in the region. So far, we've talked about the National Defense Strategy from 2018, Advantage at Sea from 2020, and the Arctic Blueprint from 2021. In between, and quite early in this lineup of strategic documents, we also find the Commandant's Strategic Planning Guidance for the US Marine Corps. It's from 2019. This is the plan for the Commandant to meet the requirements given in the NDS. Both Russia and China are still mentioned as potential adversaries, and you would expect the development of the future Marine Corps to take this into consideration. However, as we've heard earlier today by Lon Strauss particularly, moving on to the Force Design 2030, words like Arctic, Russia, Northern Flank are not mentioned at all. I do appreciate the fact that Commandant Berger makes it clear that he cannot afford to establish and maintain domain-specific competency, including knowledge about the Arctic. And my understanding is that the idea is to create a flexible force and structure that can operate under any condition anywhere in the world. And I guess this is the same sort of mantra as Commandant Amos had in his days, that the Marine Corps would be the right force in the right place at the right time. And this is where I'm getting curious. You might remember USS Gunston Hall and USS New York, both amphibious ships and part of the Iwo Jima Amphibious Readiness Group, with the 24th MEU embarked, never making it to the exercise Trident juncture in 2018. Of course, this was an exercise and safety comes first, but Gunston Hall experienced what is described as very bad weather, and she took damages to the well deck and some injured personnel. Luckily, no serious casualties, but Gunston Hall and New York returned to Iceland for repairs, while the embarked troops, the Marines, were flown into Norway for the exercise. And for me, this is an example of standards of training, being prepared, know the normal, what is normal weather conditions in this part of the world. And as far as I know, none of the ships, or even any other amphib ships, has been back since in order to train and prepare and meet the conditions. Understanding what is normal weather conditions in this part of the world is paramount in order to conduct operations. And Rear Admiral Brad Skillman, commander of the Expeditionary Strike Group 2 for the deployment to Trident Juncture, said after the training near Iceland that they are used to take people inside to cool them down. That was the normal. Now they have to focus on getting people inside to warm them up. A useful observation. And it does not stop there. You might have seen photos of the convoys going to Murmansk during World War II. Ice on ships is challenging. And some of the US Navy destroyers based in Rota, Spain, conducted in 2020 a couple of patrols into the Barents Sea. They have experienced the operating climate you can describe as normal, but they're only a few out of many. And if you do not understand what is expected and normal, and do not know how to handle it, it could severely impact your ability to operate in such an environment. Distributed maritime operations, expeditionary advanced base operations, and a concept about conducting littoral operations in a contested environment, LOCI, to bring it all together, are all interesting concepts. But if they are developed for the Indo-Pacific and Central Pacific theaters, there might be challenges, in my view, to apply them in the Arctic. With the US Marine Corps using China and the Indo-Pacific region apparently as the benchmark for developing their Force Design 2030, I find it natural to make a remark that the two theaters just mentioned have very different normals. The knowledge about both is there, but it will be very interesting to observe how this development continues. Technology will be challenged in the Arctic climate, tactics will be challenged in the Arctic. It's useful to know how to ski and dig snow caves, but not very helpful if you cannot get to shore from the ship, and if the ship never gets there. Conducting ship-to-shore movements and sprayed with icy saltwater en route to the beach creates challenges when ashore in freezing temperatures. Based on the assumption that planners are aware of the normal, I am crossing fingers that we do not see a Marine Corps not equipped and trained or able to conduct operations in the Arctic conditions in the future. And I'm trusting Lance Strauss when he's sort of saying that they are looking into this, because I was sort of glad to observe that I'm not the only one. I was almost feeling like I was presenting the devil's advocate view here on strategies and the development. Winter is coming. Cold Response 22 is coming. I know that the elements of 2MEF will participate. I don't know if they will do amphibious operations or only land operations during that exercise. I would really like to see some amphibs up there in March, April timeframe of the year. But preparing for the cold and extreme weather and harsh operating environment is important. And finally, expect the unexpected when it comes to reactions from the adversaries. Take the initiative, own the narrative, in order to make this activity a part of what is the normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. And to wrap up our opening comments, I'd like to send it over to Dr. Handeland.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm honored to participate in the panel with such excellent participants. My point of view is from a legal perspective. Since I'm a legal scholar, I look into especially navigation in relation to maritime operations in the Arctic. And I'm going to give you an introduction in navigation rights for warships in the Northwest and Northeast passages. The theme might be familiar for some of you, but I like to sum up some of the rules I find most important to address in this forum. And it was mentioned that the Arctic is changing from green or from white to blue due to global warming. So I'm not going to introduce that, but I will go into the legal issues, because when the ice is melting, the sea is opening up, and we will be able to use these areas in a different way that we have been using this far. And with ice melting in the Arctic, enabling new sailing routes, the debate has flourished again whether warships should have navigational rights like transit passage or innocent passage in especially the Northeast Passage and the Northwest Passage. And to some of you, you might wonder, why do I drag innocent passage into this? Because usually we discuss the claims relating to internal waters versus transit passage. But because of climate change, we might need to discuss innocent passage as well, especially regarding the Northeast Passage, because if we are lacking ice, the sea will open up, and perhaps we need to take a look at the different navigational regimes again. But of course, this will not happen tomorrow. It takes some years to get there, but it's important to have the different rule sets when discussing navigational rights. But if we start with transit passage, by transit passage, we refer to the ability to navigate through a passage in straits used for international navigation. And the regime has two criteria to fulfill. First, a geographical condition, and also a functional test. The geographical condition means that it needs to connect exclusive economic zone with a high sea, or exclusive economic zone with another exclusive economic zone. And so this is the easy criteria, at least in my opinion. The functional test, however, is debated, especially whether future use or use in the past should be or define the criteria. And it's also debated how many foreign flagged ships is necessary to establish such a regime. Some of the reasons why it's very important to define whether these rules should apply or not is because it allows warships to operate in what we call normal mode. Like in example, submarines might be submerged and the strait cannot be suspended. This follows from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Article 39 and 44. And this regime is different from the regime with innocent passage in the territorial sea, which allows the coastal state to restrict warships while navigating based on the criteria that they need to act innocent in accordance with Article 17 in UNCLOS following. And compared to transit passage, submarines cannot be submerged while passing. So it's important, especially to warships, which the navigational regime to apply. When it comes to the internal water claim, both Russia and Canada claims the water bordering the passages, both Northwest and Northeast passages, as internal waters based on either historic title, or they are applying the rules in UNCLOS Article 234 about ice-covered areas. If we take the internal water based on historic title first, the problem in relation to historic title was discussed during the South China Sea arbitration, which you might have heard of, which stated that UNCLOS supersede previous claims apart from those mentioned in the Convention Article 10 and 15, which refers to historic base and delimitations of the territorial sea between two coastal states. But we also have historic rights, which is a bit different because it doesn't necessarily means full and absolute sovereignty, but it perhaps means that you have some sovereign rights to, in example, fishing. So it's also important to divide those two claims from each other. And about the other view that both Canada and Russia might restrict passage based on the Article 234 about ice-covered areas. This application this article does not apply to warships according to Article 236 because they are sovereign immune vessels. So if you have fallen off, I am so sorry, but that's at least the starting point from the different legal perspectives that we meet. And the reason why it's important to know while operating in the Arctic is that every time we're sailing, we are expressing our country's opinion or view on which navigation regime to apply. And it was also, some of you might remember when France conducted or navigated through the Northern Sea route without prior notification to Russia, and Russia started to, or they tried to create new rules to restrict warships even further, because the definition of the Northern Sea route is larger than only internal waters. It's a huge area, but they wanted to restrict the navigation rights for warships even further. But this has only been a suggestion. It's not Russian law at this point, but the fact that they have discussed it is important to have in mind while operating. And in the Q&A, we might touch into China as well, because China is an interesting actor when it comes to navigating through these waters. And as Walter mentioned earlier, we have seen some Chinese ships, but in my opinion, they haven't been that active as some might thought. So at this point, China lays low, in my view, but it's important to notice that in Chinese regulations, they has restrictions in their own areas, or at least areas they claim to be their own territorial sea, where no foreign vessels for military use may enter territorial sea or airspace above without permission. And my last point about the permission is that some countries, they prefer to have a regime where they require permission to enter the territorial sea, while others don't. Some use notification, some use diplomatic clearance. It's different state practice around these issues, but it's important to know while navigating a warship which rules that applies, and also to know a bit about the different claims in the area for operation. So I think I'm going to stop there, and please provide some questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Handeland. Really appreciate your legal perspective on a lot of the issues that we've been looking at. With that, as suspected, in 1 hour today, we didn't solve all of the maritime issues in the Arctic, and the conversation continues this afternoon. So I please invite everyone. We've got 2 more sessions today to hop in and continue to learn. And in the meantime, please continue to follow the Krulak Center to get more information on future events and content. So thank you again for all of our panelists attending today, and everyone have a great day.